I do kind of do these a bit ad lib. I'm not very much of an expert at this yet. I've only done a few talks on the actual travels this year. So probably start with what is a wheelwright. Kind of hoping that a few of you will understand what I do. I make wooden wheels for a living, which is quite archaic now. And I'd like to say that it's definitely coming back a little bit, but we need to get it out in the public eye more. We need to get people to understand that wheelwriting is still going on. You can still get wheels for your cart, your wagon. And we need to encourage new people into the trade. As you can see, I'm reasonably young. I'm only in my 30s. I'm currently the youngest master wheelwright in the UK, quite possibly in Europe, and I'm one of the youngest in the world at the moment. And it is quite lonely. It's a bit of a shame to be in that position. So I've been pushing forward to do more with what I do as a wheelwright instead of just sitting in the workshop all day or standing in the workshop. Don't let anyone catch me sitting around. I want to pass on the skills, and I want to encourage new people to take up the trade and to get to spread the word a bit. So I basically approached the Churchill Trust, and this is where I am now. And for my travels, I went to America and Canada. Travelled right across the USA and visited, I think it was 15 states in total, visiting different wheelwrights and tradesmen on the way. And the main reasoning for going there was we have a lot of issues over here now. It's not just getting people into the trade, but it's making sure that when they come into the trade, there's going to be work for them to do, there's going to be materials for them to carry on the work. I don't know if many people know about the diseases that we've currently got in the timber in the UK, but we've got ash dieback, Dutch elm disease and southern oak death. And the basics of a wheel are we use elm for the naves, we use oak for the spokes and ash for the fellies, which are the rim around the outside. So given another 20 or 30 years, we could potentially not have any wood to make a wheel. So ideally, we need to find replacements. So I went to America and visited the wheelwrights there. Probably would help if I had some pictures of where we got to. Basically, my idea was initially to see how the Americans had adapted. And it's a very new, how do you call it, in the new colonies, it's probably not the correct term, but they've had to adapt when they went over there. They've had to overcome different issues like lack of timbers and resources. And in it being only recent history, 1700s onwards, I was hoping that we could maybe get somewhere with that. So I started off in Colonial Williamsburg, which is in Virginia, and they have an absolutely amazing museum. If anyone's ever been there, you'll probably agree with what I could say about them. Everything is set in the 1700s, so there was no machinery and very little equipment as such. It was all hand tools, and it's quite fascinating to see how they did things in the period in America, and it reflected in a lot of ways how things were done here. But it gave me a good foundation to set off across the states and to see basically how things changed, how they evolved, and hopefully why as well. So in Colonial Williamsburg, I was lucky enough to get to dress up in period costume, which I like an excuse to put fancy old clothing on, and I did look very good in my breeches and tricorn. But basically, it was so similar to the UK, to the traditional ways we would make wheels in the UK. They're still using elm for the naves, using oak for the spokes and ash for the fellies, which is the basic three elements that we use. They're still bonding the wheels, still putting tyres on in a similar way, and strakes. And I was hoping to see some sort of evolution there from that point. And they were making some, I would say, slight changes in that they were using a lot more basic methods probably, because they didn't have, at the beginning, they didn't have the very fine carriages and coaches. They were basic vehicles. It was probably only later on in the period that they were going to using coaches and carriages for the elite to ride round in, especially going out towards revolutionary period. But, we tried not to talk about that too much because I was afraid they'd dress me up in a red coat and use me for rifle practice. Especially a few times when mentioning where I was from, being English and from Lancashire. It didn't go down too well with some of the locals. But, so on from there, we started to travel north and gradually west across the country, and ended up with very much a last-minute arrangement. And I found social media to be absolutely wonderful, and I probably shouldn't have lent on social media too much, but by spreading the word on social media through Facebook and Twitter, I got a few contacts that would start to follow the journey, and met a lovely fellow. It's a blacksmith by trade, and he actually took me on to meet some Amish wheelwrights, which for the past 18 months before I went, I was trying my best to contact some Amish wheelwrights, and every letter had failed and no one was interested in helping. So we ended up with this contact who was a blacksmith who had had an Amish wheelwright do work for him, and he made me an introduction. So we very hastily made our way to the wheelwright shop, and it was a bit of a surprise, because a lot of people would imagine the Amish to be very, and not to sound derogatory, but we're very backwards and very old-fashioned compared to us. But to my shock, there wasn't a single hand tool in the workshop, apart from a hammer and a few spanners, which, it was very, very impressive in some respects, but then it totally turned my idea of how the Amish work on its head. The whole workshop was mechanical. If it couldn't be made on a machine, they didn't want to do it. And there were some fantastic machines. Most of these machines were built themselves in the workshop, which the ingenuity was just fascinating. I could have spent weeks there. Probably wouldn't have come home if I'd spent much longer. And basically, the way they've adapted is by going into mass production to a degree, which is very difficult to implicate over here. But they could make 200 wheels in 2 weeks, where, to put that into perspective, I'm lucky if I do 200 wheels in a year, sometimes even 2 years if I'm lucky. And so they really have advanced in that area. Although most of the machinery that they didn't build themselves was actually pre-1900s. So there was an industrial period where wheelwrighting was quite busy. So they've taken advantage of that and collected the machinery. So from that, which actually threw me back a little bit and made me realise that I was going to discover a lot more than I originally anticipated. We went on and we headed across country. We visited Harley Chandler's wheelwright shop. Now he was a very interesting guy. I can't tell you a lot of the things he said because they're very much not repeatable in public. One of 3 brothers, and they live in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky. And he has a beautiful collection of machinery and equipment, and he goes doing demonstrations. And one of the most interesting parts I found was that he'd adapted, that when he was in a area of the country where they have no wood for the fire, because we have to heat the tyres up for the wheel to expand them to put them on, and he wants to heat the tyres up, he uses corn cobs, because there's a lot of corn growing in the area, which it still fascinates me, the ingenuity. And then from there we went on to South Dakota, and South Dakota has Hanson Wagon and Wheel. Now they are by far probably the most interesting and industrial wheelwrights that I've met, and they're up to date, and they make beautiful coaches and carriages. And I'm getting a countdown now because I'm rambling on. We go across to, all the way across in the end to the West Coast. We visited a carriage museum which was expanding. And what that's taught me with these museums that I visited, we visited a few along the way, is that you can also adapt now, not just to make wooden wheels for customers, but you can do them for the public, for displays, and you can make it more interesting for people. And that can also encourage the skills to survive, which is what I've got a lot to thank for the trust for. Because thanks to my travels, we've managed to make links with museums in the United States. We've actually recently sent 2 apprentices over, the first 2 apprentices in the UK in decades, and we sent them over to America to work for 4 weeks. And they've recently come back and carried on with their learning journey, and hopefully we'll encourage more through the Trust in the future. So great thanks to the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust and to everyone involved, and thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed my talk.